The morning sun filtered through the wide, ancient branches of the oak tree, scattering golden light across the front yard like a blessing. Its trunk was thick and deeply grooved, its bark darkened by time and weather, yet still strong, like the beating heart of the land itself. Beneath its sprawling canopy lay a small bronze plaque half covered in moss, reading, "Planted 1823, preserved for generations." To most, it was just a tree. But to Daniel Mercer, it was home, memory, and history intertwined. He had grown up climbing those branches, tying tire swings, and sitting beneath it on summer evenings with his father, listening to stories about the early settlers who first built the town around this land. The tree wasn't just part of the property, it was the property. It was the soul of the Mercer family's old farmhouse. After his father passed away, Daniel inherited the house, a two-story colonial with white shutters, chipped paint, and a wide porch that creaked with age. When he moved back in, he promised himself he'd protect everything his father loved, starting with the oak. He spent weekends tending to it, laying mulch around its roots, and keeping the lawn pristine despite the growing number of rules the Pinebrook Estate's HOA had begun enforcing. They had formed only 2 years earlier, when a wave of new residents decided to modernize the neighborhood. At first, Daniel didn't pay much attention, until the day the new HOA president, Margaret Hensley, showed up at his door. She was dressed in her usual pressed khaki pants and pastel cardigan, clipboard in hand, that practiced smile of polite hostility stretched across her face. Behind her stood 2 board members, flanking her like Secret Service agents guarding the sanctity of suburban perfection. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," she began, her tone clipped and professional. "I'm here to address a few issues we've noticed on your property." She glanced up, shielding her eyes from the sun as she stared at the oak towering above them. "That would be the first." Daniel frowned, unsure he'd heard her right. She went on, "According to Section 12C of the HOA's landscaping code, all front yard vegetation must maintain an unobstructed sightline from the street. That tree," she jabbed her pen toward it like it had committed a crime, "is obstructing not only the curb view but also the overall aesthetic uniformity of Pinebrook Estates. It's also dangerously close to your power lines." Daniel couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "Ma'am, that oak has been here since before Pinebrook Estates even existed. It's a protected heritage tree. It's older than every house on this street combined." Margaret's lips tightened. "Be that as it may," she replied, "the HOA's standards apply to all homeowners. We can't make exceptions just because something is old." Her tone on that last word dripped with the same disdain people reserve for out-of-style furniture. She handed him a bright orange violation notice, folded perfectly into thirds. "You'll need to have it removed within 30 days to avoid fines." Then she turned on her heel and left, clipboard snapping shut with a sound that echoed like a gavel. That evening, Daniel sat on the porch staring at the oak while the sun sank behind its branches. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle. He remembered his father's words from years ago, "This tree has roots deeper than any man's greed. If you ever have to fight for it, fight hard." Those words now felt prophetic. He pulled the notice from his pocket and read the bold letters, "Non-compliance fine, $500 per day." He couldn't believe it. The HOA, a group of people who hadn't even lived here a decade, wanted to erase a piece of living history because it didn't fit their clean, modern vision of suburbia. He knew Margaret wasn't just enforcing rules, she was establishing dominance. To her, control was prettier than preservation. The next morning, Daniel attended the HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse, a place that always smelled faintly of disinfectant and smugness. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board sat, coffee cups and printed agendas lined up like an army of bureaucracy. Margaret, at the center, gave her opening remarks about maintaining the neighborhood's prestige. When it was time for homeowner concerns, Daniel raised his hand and calmly explained the oak's history, its protected status, and the family connection it carried. Some neighbors nodded sympathetically, but others avoided his gaze, unwilling to challenge the board. Margaret smiled thinly. "While we respect your sentimentality, Mr. Mercer, emotion cannot override community standards," she said. "If we allow one exception, we open the floodgates for disorder." The board murmured in agreement. He realized then, logic wasn't going to save his tree. These people didn't care about heritage or legality. They cared about control and uniform lawns. When he walked home that night, a deep, cold anger settled in his chest. The oak stood tall against the moonlight, its leaves whispering in the breeze as if reminding him it had seen far worse than this: storms, wars, droughts, time itself. And it was still here. Daniel ran his hand along its bark, feeling the ridges like the wrinkles of an old friend. "Don't worry," he whispered. "They won't touch you. Not while I'm still breathing." In that moment, under the glow of the street lamps and the soft hum of cicadas, Daniel made a silent vow: if the HOA wanted a fight, they'd get one. But it wouldn't be a shouting match. It would be a war of paperwork, patience, and law. The same roots that anchored the oak to the earth would anchor his resolve. And as the night deepened, the neighborhood went quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves overhead. The oak stood firm against the darkness, a silhouette of defiance and dignity. It had outlasted generations, and it would outlast this petty suburban tyranny too. The stage was set, not for the fall of a tree, but for the downfall of those who underestimated what it meant to protect something with roots that ran deeper than rules. The next few days passed in a haze of frustration and disbelief. Every time Daniel looked out his front window, his eyes locked onto the bright orange violation notice still taped to his mailbox post, a garish scar against the peaceful green of his yard. The paper flapped in the autumn wind, its bold black print a constant reminder that his fight had officially begun. Each morning, as he sipped his coffee on the porch, neighbors would walk their dogs or jog by, glancing at the notice and then quickly looking away. Some offered sympathetic nods, others whispered under their breath, afraid of drawing the HOA's attention themselves. That was the unspoken rule in Pinebrook Estates: don't challenge the board. It was a community built on fear disguised as order, and Margaret Hensley ruled it like a queen with a clipboard instead of a crown. 3 days after her visit, Daniel received the official HOA violation packet in the mail. Inside was a letter typed on heavy stationery with the Pinebrook Estates logo embossed at the top, as though the authority of the document could be felt in its texture. It stated, in cold bureaucratic phrasing, that failure to remove the obstructive and non-conforming oak tree within 30 days would result in daily fines of $500 and possible legal action for continued non-compliance. The language was designed to intimidate, every word chosen to crush resistance before it could form. Attached was a list of approved landscaping companies, conveniently all affiliated with HOA board members. The implication was clear: they wanted Daniel to pay for his own surrender. He read the letter twice before setting it down on the kitchen table beside the old family photo album. The open page showed a black and white picture of his father standing under the same oak tree, his hand resting on its trunk with pride. That image steadied Daniel's breath. He knew he couldn't just tear the notice down and ignore it. That's what the HOA wanted. They wanted him angry and reactive, so they could paint him as the stubborn troublemaker in their next meeting. No, he needed to move smarter than that. He needed proof, documentation, and allies. That night, he called Dr. Samuel Leary, a local arborist and conservation expert who had once spoken at a town hall about protected trees. Leary agreed to come inspect the oak first thing in the morning. When the arborist arrived, his reaction was instant awe. "This isn't just an old tree, Mr. Mercer," he said, running a hand across the massive trunk. "It's a registered Quercus virginiana, a southern live oak, at least 2 centuries old, maybe older. If this were downtown, the city would have landmarked it decades ago." Daniel followed as the expert circled the base, taking notes, measurements, and photos. "I'll draft a full report," Leary promised. "If your HOA tries to cut this down, they're violating state environmental law. You'll have them by the throat legally." For the first time in days, Daniel felt a spark of hope. He wasn't powerless, not yet. That hope didn't last long. 2 evenings later, Margaret and her 2 board members appeared again, this time as the sun was setting, their shadows long and sharp against the pavement. "Mr. Mercer," she began curtly, "we've noticed no action has been taken regarding your violation." Daniel crossed his arms and gestured toward the arborist's fresh report lying on a lawn chair. "Action has been taken," he said calmly. "A certified expert examined the tree and confirmed it's both healthy and protected. You're the ones in violation now if you proceed." Margaret didn't even glance at the paper. "We don't recognize outside consultants," she replied coolly. "The HOA has full authority over landscaping within Pinebrook Estates, and our board unanimously agrees the tree must go." Her voice hardened on that last word, must. "If you fail to comply, We will authorize removal ourselves and bill you for the cost. For a brief moment, Daniel saw it clearly, the glint of arrogance behind her composure. Margaret wasn't trying to beautify the neighborhood. She was trying to erase everything that didn't fit her vision of control. He could see the thrill it gave her to stand on his lawn, backed by bylaws and signatures, believing herself untouchable. He smiled faintly, not in amusement but defiance. "You go ahead," he said quietly. "But when this blows up, make sure you spell my name right in the lawsuit." The smallest flicker of uncertainty passed across her face, but she quickly masked it. "You have 27 days remaining," she said, before turning away. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as the board retreated, their silhouettes swallowed by the deepening dusk. That night, Daniel sat beneath the oak again, the air thick with the smell of fallen leaves. The branches swayed gently above, whispering through the twilight like the voice of his father, reminding him that patience and truth would outlast tyranny. He looked at the folder in his hands, violation letters, legal notices, arborist reports, and realized this was more than a battle for a tree. It was a test of principle, of whether a man's heritage could be stripped by a committee with clipboards. The HOA might have its rules, but the city had its laws, and he intended to use them. He opened his laptop, began drafting emails to the City Department of Environmental Conservation, attaching every report and document he had. When he hit send, he looked up at the oak's branches silhouetted against the moon and said softly, "Let's see who they're really messing with." As the wind rustled through the leaves and the distant sound of sprinklers hissed down the street, Daniel knew the battle lines were drawn. He wasn't just fighting to keep a tree standing. He was standing against an entire system built on quiet compliance. And in the stillness of that night, he decided, if the HOA wanted a war, they just declared one. The city offices weren't the kind of place Daniel ever expected to spend his mornings, but that week, they became his battleground. He sat in the worn lobby chair of the Department of Environmental Conservation, clutching a manila folder packed with photos, letters, and the arborist's report. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights filled the air, punctuated by the distant ring of telephones and the shuffle of paper. Behind the counter, a city clerk in her 50s peered over her glasses and called his number. "Next, please," she said, her tone efficient but kind. Daniel stepped up, placing the folder on the counter as though it contained evidence for a trial. "I need to report an HOA attempting to remove a protected heritage tree," he said. That caught her attention. "Heritage tree," she repeated, straightening in her chair. "Those are under Category A protection. Removal without city authorization carries serious penalties." Daniel nodded. "Then you might want to take a look at this." He slid the folder toward her. Inside were photos of the 200-year-old oak, the HOA violation notice, and the arborist's full certification of its species and age. The clerk flipped through the documents, her eyebrows rising with every page. "You said this is in Pinebrook Estates?" she asked. When Daniel confirmed, she let out a quiet sigh. "We've had a few complaints from that HOA recently. They're enthusiastic about their rules." She excused herself to the back office, returning moments later with a man in a city jacket embroidered with Urban Forestry Division. He introduced himself as Inspector Tony Valdez, and his handshake was firm and deliberate. "Let's go see this oak of yours," he said. By the time they arrived at Daniel's property, the late morning sun was spilling across the yard, illuminating the oak's immense canopy. Valdez stepped out of his truck, craned his neck to take it all in, and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's not just heritage, that's historic." He began his inspection with practiced precision, pacing around the trunk, taking core samples, and noting its coordinates on a digital tablet. "This tree predates the founding of Pinebrook by a good 100 years, he said, crouching near the roots. "It's protected under State Heritage Preservation Code 9.3, subsection C. No one, not even a homeowners association, can touch it without city and state approval. Cutting this down would be like bulldozing a monument." Daniel watched as Valdez placed a small green metal tag into the soil beside the trunk, a city marker signifying it was under official review. "We'll file the paperwork today," Valdez said. "Until this process is complete, this tree is off-limits to any removal activity." Daniel felt a weight lift off his chest, though he didn't let relief show just yet. He'd learned too well that the HOA thrived on intimidation, not legality. "They're planning to bring in a removal crew next week," he explained. Valdez glanced up sharply. Not anymore, they're not. He pulled out his phone, made a quick call to his office, and spoke with crisp authority. Flag Pinebrook Estates under pending investigation. Any removal orders are hereby suspended until further notice. For the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself a slow smile. The roots of justice were finally taking hold. But Margaret Hensley wasn't one to back down quietly. The following morning, Daniel woke to the sound of engines outside his window. Through the blinds, he saw 2 landscaping trucks idling at the curb, men unloading chainsaws and ropes. His stomach dropped. The HOA had ignored the suspension order. He grabbed his phone and called Valdez immediately. "They're here," he said, voice tight. "They're actually here to cut it down." Valdez didn't hesitate. "Keep them there. Don't confront them. We're on our way." Within 20 minutes, a convoy of city vehicles appeared, 2 trucks from the Urban Forestry Division and 1 from the local police department. The scene that followed looked almost cinematic. The landscapers froze mid-motion as Valdez stepped out with a clipboard and a badge, flanked by 2 officers. "Gentlemen," he said, voice echoing down the street, "put those saws down." Margaret emerged from her house moments later, still in her pressed pink cardigan, lips pursed. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, storming across the lawn. "This is HOA business. You can't just show up here." Valdez cut her off with professional calm. "Actually, ma'am, I can. You're attempting to remove a protected heritage tree. That's a state violation. Did you file a permit with the city?" Margaret's expression faltered. "The HOA doesn't require city approval for internal maintenance," she snapped. Valdez raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, heritage protection supersedes HOA bylaws. Your internal maintenance could have just cost your association upwards of $50,000 in fines." Gasps rippled through the small crowd of curious neighbors gathering along the sidewalk. Daniel stood silently beside the oak, arms crossed, watching the color drain from Margaret's face. She turned to him, fury blazing in her eyes. "You did this, didn't you? You went behind our backs," she hissed. Daniel met her glare with quiet satisfaction. "No," he said. "I followed the law. You tried to break it." The police officer accompanying Valdez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I suggest you and your crew step away from the property." One of the landscapers quickly shut off his chainsaw, muttering under his breath, "Didn't sign up for this." Within minutes, the trucks began to pull away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the street, clutching her clipboard like a shield that suddenly felt very small. Valdez filled out his report on the spot, taking photos and documenting the HOA's unauthorized attempt. He handed Daniel a copy of the official Heritage Protection Order, printed with the city seal in gold. "This makes it untouchable now," Valdez said. "Not just by the HOA, but by anyone. Congratulations, Mr. Mercer. You just turned your tree into a city landmark." Daniel looked up at the oak, its leaves shimmering in the sunlight like it knew it had just survived another century's worth of ignorance. For a moment, he felt something deeper than victory, pride. Pride that he'd stood up not only for his home but for a piece of living history. As the officers and inspectors drove away, neighbors began approaching him one by one. Some offered handshakes, others apologies for not speaking up sooner. "Good on you, Daniel," one man said. "About time someone stood up to her." Across the street, Margaret watched from her porch, seething in silence as her power began to crack like brittle glass. The oak stood unscathed, its great shadow stretching across the road like a defiant crown. And in that quiet afternoon light, Daniel realized that what had started as a battle over a tree was slowly becoming something much larger, a reckoning for the entire HOA. The roots of rebellion had finally broken the surface. For a few days after the confrontation, Pinebrook Estates fell into an uneasy quiet. The kind of silence that follows a storm, not peaceful, but expectant. Neighbors whispered about what had happened outside Daniel's house. The city officials, the police, the halted chainsaws. Rumors spread faster than the autumn wind, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Some said the HOA president was being investigated. Others claimed Daniel had secretly sued the entire board. Whatever the story, one thing was certain. The aura of invincibility around Margaret Hensley had cracked. She stopped patrolling the neighborhood every morning, her clipboard mysteriously absent. Yet beneath that temporary calm, Daniel knew the board was regrouping, nursing their wounded pride and planning their next move. He didn't have to wait long to see it. A week later, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox stamped, "Certified Mail, HOA Legal Affairs." Inside was a letter filled with the same smug legal jargon he'd come to expect. This time, the HOA claimed property defacement, arguing that by allowing the city to mark the oak as a heritage site, Daniel had altered the visual character of the neighborhood without board consent. The fine, $5,000, due immediately. He read the letter twice before laughing out loud, a sharp, disbelieving sound that startled even him. It was absurd. They were doubling down on the very arrogance that had already exposed them. But what they didn't realize was that while they were busy writing fines, the city of Willow Bend's environmental division was finishing its own paperwork. And that paperwork wasn't in the HOA's favor. 3 days later, a convoy of official vehicles once again rolled into Pinebrook Estates, but this time they weren't visiting Daniel. They parked directly outside the HOA office, a converted model home near the entrance of the community. Margaret was already on the porch when the city inspector stepped out, her usual self-assured smile plastered on, though her hands fidgeted at her sides. The lead inspector, the same Tony Valdez who had visited Daniel, walked up the steps, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Hensley," he said formally, "the City of Willow Bend hereby issues a citation to the Pinebrook Estates Homeowners Association for violation of State Heritage Preservation Code 9.3, subsection C, unlawful attempt to remove a registered heritage tree." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Your association is responsible for initiating and funding an unauthorized removal process on private property, resulting in a state environmental offense. He handed her the paper. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the bolded total at the bottom. Civil penalty, $50,000. The sound of camera shutters followed the silence. Several neighbors had gathered with their phones, recording the moment the once feared HOA president was officially fined. One woman whispered, "Serves her right." Another laughed quietly, "I told her she'd pushed too far." Margaret's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "We were acting in the best interest of the community. The tree posed a hazard." Valdez didn't even blink. "The arborist's report and city records show otherwise. You were notified of the tree's heritage status before the attempted removal. Ignorance isn't a defense." He signed his clipboard and nodded toward his team. "You'll be receiving a court date for the hearing within 30 days. In the meantime, this property is under investigation for misuse of HOA funds." The inspectors turned to leave, their professionalism a perfect contrast to Margaret's unraveling composure. That evening, Daniel stood on his porch again as the golden sunset filtered through the oak's branches, watching as neighbors gathered in small groups up and down the street. The story had spread across the entire subdivision, and now people who once feared the HOA were finding their voices. A group of homeowners drafted a petition demanding a full audit of the association's finances, citing the $50,000 fine and the president's mismanagement. Daniel hadn't started the movement, but his quiet defiance had sparked it. By the end of the week, over 60% of the community signed the petition, forcing a special meeting. When the night of the meeting came, the clubhouse was packed, folding chairs filled, people standing in the back, murmuring with anticipation. Margaret entered, her smile forced and her tone brittle. "Let's begin," she said, gavel in hand. But the crowd wasn't listening. A homeowner in the front row stood up, voice firm. "You cost this community $50,000 and dragged us into a state investigation over one man's tree." Another shouted, "You've been fining us for lawn lengths and mailbox colors while breaking the law yourself." The room erupted in agreement. Margaret slammed the gavel, demanding order, but it was useless. Her authority had collapsed completely. After 10 chaotic minutes, the treasurer announced his resignation, followed by 2 more board members. The vote that followed was swift and unanimous. Margaret Hensley was officially removed as HOA president. The silence that followed her exit was unlike the fearful quiet from before. This one was cleansing, almost sacred. Daniel sat near the back of the room, listening as neighbors discussed new leadership, transparency, and a return to reason. For the first time in years, Pinebrook Estates felt like a community again instead of a dictatorship with manicured lawns. People approached him afterward, some apologetic, others simply thankful. "You didn't just save that tree, one older man said, shaking his hand. "You saved the whole neighborhood." Daniel smiled, glancing through the clubhouse window at the silhouette of the oak under the streetlights outside. Its branches swayed gently, casting long shadows across the pavement, like the arms of something ancient and proud blessing the ground it had guarded for centuries. As Daniel walked home under that great canopy, the smell of cool night air filled his lungs. The oak rustled softly above him, and he swore he could almost hear his father's voice in the wind. "Told you, son, its roots run deeper than their rules." He looked back once more toward the clubhouse where Margaret's reign had just ended, then toward the tree that had stood its ground for 200 years and inspired an entire neighborhood to do the same. The fine hadn't just turned the tables, it had uprooted an empire built on fear. And now, as the moonlight bathed the yard, Daniel finally felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The months that followed were strangely quiet, like the world had exhaled after a storm that had raged too long. Autumn came and went, painting the old oak's canopy in a firestorm of gold and crimson, the leaves swirling in soft spirals over the lawn. For the first time in nearly a year, peace returned to Pine Grove Estates, a peace that didn't come from HOA rules or bylaws, but from something more ancient and enduring: respect. Ethan often found himself standing at his front porch with a mug of coffee, watching the morning light filter through the massive branches, each one whispering a soft victory song against the tyranny that tried to silence it. He still remembered the chaos, the shouting, the police tape around the base of the tree, but now all that remained was calm, and a renewed sense of pride in what he'd protected. After the city's ruling, the HOA had been forced to pay a hefty fine, not just in money, but in reputation. Karen, the once dominant president, had resigned within a week, her empire of control collapsing under the weight of public humiliation. She avoided the street entirely, taking detours just to escape the reminder of her downfall. Meanwhile, the city officially declared Ethan's Oak a heritage landmark, ensuring that no one could ever touch it again. A small bronze plaque was installed at its base, gleaming in the sunlight. Protected by law, for generations to come. Ethan had requested a second, smaller inscription beneath it, engraved simply with the words, "For Dad, who planted roots that outlived fear." He'd knelt beside it when it was unveiled, hand resting against the bark, eyes damp with a gratitude he couldn't put into words. Neighbors who once kept their distance began to stop by, often lingering longer than they planned. Some apologized quietly, admitting they had doubted him or feared the HOA's retaliation. Others brought small gifts, homemade cookies, a potted plant, even a handwritten note from an elderly neighbor saying the tree had been her favorite view since she was a little girl. Ethan didn't seek praise. He only smiled, offered them shade, and told them they were always welcome to sit on the new oakwood bench he'd built around the base of the tree. It became a gathering spot. Children played near its roots, couples rested there during evening walks, and the sound of laughter began to replace the tension that once poisoned the air. Pine Grove Estates, once defined by petty rules and rigid order, was finding something better: community. One warm afternoon in spring, a city journalist arrived to interview Ethan for a local piece titled "The Tree That Won." She asked him what it meant to win against the HOA, but Ethan had to think before answering. He glanced up at the sunlight breaking through the leaves and said softly, "It wasn't about winning. It was about remembering that some things are bigger than us, and they deserve to stay." The article went viral within days, inspiring homeowners across the country who faced similar HOA overreach. Messages flooded Ethan's inbox, strangers thanking him for standing his ground, for reminding them that heritage and heart could triumph over bureaucracy. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came one quiet evening. Ethan was sitting on the bench under the oak, the air humming with crickets, when he heard soft footsteps on the sidewalk. Karen stood there, thinner, quieter, and carrying none of her old arrogance. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice stripped of pride, she said, "I didn't understand before why it mattered so much." She looked up at the branches, her tone almost reverent. "It's beautiful." Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond. Forgiveness wasn't something you could rush. It grew slowly, like roots finding their way through stone. "It always was," he said finally. She gave a small nod, eyes glistening, and walked away into the dusk. He didn't stop her. Some lessons didn't need words, just time and humility. As twilight deepened, fireflies began to flicker around the oak, their light reflecting off the bronze plaque. Ethan leaned back against the bench, feeling the steady heartbeat of the world through the trunk at his back. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying a sound that felt almost like a whisper, his father's voice, reminding him that true strength doesn't come from power or control, but from patience and roots that run deep. The oak would outlive them all, the HOAs, the arguments, even the houses themselves. It would stand tall long after names faded and rules were forgotten, its branches reaching for the stars, a living monument to endurance and love. And in that moment, beneath its vast and ancient canopy, Ethan smiled, not the smile of victory, but of peace. The kind of peace that comes only when you protect something sacred, not for yourself, but for everyone who comes after. The kind of peace that reminds you that justice, like nature, always finds its way back to the light. Deciduous tree.